cost them a couple hours tomorrow. So, Mr. Cole?
Thank you very much, and I want to thank my friend for being there, and I want to echo Ms. Fox's point about we're all going to miss you. My nickname for Mr. Whitfield is the Grand Poobah of the Turkish caucus, of which I'm proud to be a member. But seriously, we've
Mr. Hastings a member too.
to work together and travel, and you've been a great member, and you will be missed. I just want to make a couple of points and get your response on this bill. I'm going to disagree a little bit with my friend from Florida. I think if you actually checked, you'd find the leases on federal lands are down, not up, under this administration, and that most of the energy production, as my friend pointed out, that has given us low energy, unprecedentedly low energy prices, have come off private land, and honestly have come without much federal involvement whatsoever. The federal government didn't have much to do with fracking, didn't discover the technology, didn't implement it, and indeed, the president predicted when he was running for office that if the policies that he wanted to implement were actually put in place, that the cost of electricity would, quote, necessarily skyrocket. And I think that's what's going to happen if some of these regulations are that the EPA is advancing and some of the policies that the administration is advancing are put in place. I have to tell you, I have no problem with renewable energy. I think it's a good thing. We actually get 17% of our electricity in Oklahoma from wind energy now. So, and I've been a strong supporter of the wind tax credit. I'm a believer in that, and I think we can achieve a lot if we incentivize behavior and work with industry, and I think in that case we did. The administration deserves some credit for that. But I think in this case we're being punitive and bureaucratic, and frankly I do think, as is so often the case, presidents use, Republican and Democrat I might add, they use the executive branch to go around Congress and use the authorities that they assert. I think we will end up in court, and the president had one view, this is not related to this, on immigration policy. May be the right thing, may be the wrong thing. He tried to do it, through executive action, and lo and behold, it didn't happen. We ended up in court. There was a stay. I think it's going to the Supreme Court now. I think the same thing's going to happen on some of this stuff. But I would invite the president to work with Congress on this a little more. I think he would find in some of these areas he's got more support on both sides of the aisle than he might expect. But I do think, to my friend's point, treating carbon-based energy, which is 80% plus of our energy supply and is going to be the leading source of energy for the rest of our lives in this room. I mean, there's almost no doubt about it, and it certainly is in other parts of the world. Finding ways to make it cleaner or finding appropriate substitutes that are cost-effective, that don't raise the prices on hardworking Americans or, frankly, hardworking people in other countries, is the right way to go. We may have a little more latitude here than people in India or China do, just given the relative living standard we have. But, I don't think it's a good thing to put thousands of coal miners out of work in places like Kentucky and Indiana and Ohio, Pennsylvania, and out west. I think there's ways to make that energy usable and affordable and clean, and we ought to be investing in those ways. I don't think you preemptively start shutting down American industries, particularly when other countries, frankly, aren't doing that. I mean, the Chinese are developing coal at a very rapid rate, about one new plant a week. And the fact that we can't do that with an abundant supply of energy here in the country is something we ought to seriously consider. So I'd ask you to address 2 points quickly. One, to your knowledge, has our energy production, again, gone up because of activity on federal land, or is energy activity on federal land lower? And two, give us some idea of what the impact of delaying projects and delaying production that some of the regulation that the EPA has proposed is.
Well, we've had a lot of hearings on this, and I think EIA and all the groups agree that increased production has occurred on private lands, and the leases on public lands has gone down, and it's due to horizontal drilling and and the discoveries in the places like the Bakken Field. So we're very fortunate in that regard, and most of the oil certainly being produced is a light sweet as opposed to a heavy sour, which is being used primarily in our refineries. That's why we think that a lot of that could be exported without significant damage to our refiners in the U.S., and other countries are looking for it. So I think you're exactly right on that point. And your second point was what now?
Yeah, the impact of regulation in
Yeah.
terms of slowing.
Yeah. Well, you know, they recently had that oil spill out off the coast of California. You remember that was about 6 months ago. And we actually had a hearing about it. And it turned out that EPA and not EPA, but the agency over the Department of Transportation that has jurisdiction over some of these pipelines were still developing their regulations of a bill that we passed in 2007 on pipeline safety. So a lot of them were giving one of the major reasons for that is that these companies are resisting expending large sums of capital, upgrading a lot of their facilities right now and building new facilities because of waiting on regulations coming out of some of the federal agencies. And one of the reasons that the federal agency's been slow on this is because the administration really has had as number one goal addressing climate change as opposed and focusing on clean energy plan and other plans like that, and OMB's placed that as a priority, and so they're dragging their feet on some basic safety regulation issues relating to pipelines, for example.
Well, you know, I would just submit, and not directly related, but I think it's illustrative, that in the administration, this pursuit of or a climate change theology, if you will, and again, I'm not debating the science, but it sometimes leads to really impractical decisions. Keystone is a pretty good example of that. If you're really worried about the environment, pipelines are a lot better way to move production than trucks and trains. It's safer,
Right,
it's
right,
cleaner, it
right.
uses less energy, it actually lowers the price by about $10 a barrel. And yet that, to me, is an example where politics and the decision-making got into what should have been a rational and pretty easy call, no matter which side of the climate change debate you happen to be on. It's just a better way to do things. Again, I think we could find some common ground, but if we're going to have really executive branch dictates as opposed to legislation hammered out, then I think this is going to continue to be an extremely contentious issue.
Well, it is, and I might say that on the clean energy plan on the existing plants, those caps established for each state are arbitrary by EPA. Initially, Kentucky was said that they would have to reduce by 18%. The final rule comes in at 41%. And so when they talk about maximum flexibility for the states, that's why you see so many of the states filing these lawsuits, because they view those limits as arbitrary, and it's going to be extremely difficult for them to meet. And for the first time ever, they're able to go outside the fence and mandate what entities are doing that really are not contributing to CO2 emissions.
We have, you know, just again for the record, my own state, we are wrestling right now with these mandates. Our state's involved in some of these lawsuits against the EPA. Now, it's the state, again, that gets 17% of its electricity from wind power that is continuing to actively develop and incentivize wind power. And yet we're about to have a $1.2 billion rate increase requested by our major utilities to offset the cost, even though by any objective measure, frankly, pollution's gone down rather than up in a place like Oklahoma, and we've been moving pretty aggressively to try and look at renewable sources of energy where they make sense for us.
Absolutely.
So, again, I applaud you and your committee for bringing forth these things. I think you have to make the argument. The president's always free to use his veto pen if he chooses to, but he won't be president forever.
Well, you know, one of the practical impacts, I mean, renewables, I mean, I think all of us support all of the above policy. I don't know that the president does, because he does not want to use coal. But California has certainly been a leader in renewables. And recently, we had a discussion with the CEO of one of the major utilities out there, and they're having to build a new grid in order to bring the renewable power into the urban areas. And he pointed out to me that it was costing them $100 million.
As opposed to working step by step in a direction that you want to go. So I think that's what you're trying to do here. I appreciate that, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Judge Hastings. Gentleman does not seek time. Mr. Polis. Gentleman does not seek time. Dr. Burgess, who will be handling this